the Labour government in Britain is, I think, probably one of the most authoritarian governments I've seen in my lifetime. From 2004 until today, Britain has had an unprecedented experiment with mass immigration. And Keir Starmer, bizarrely, is claiming to be tough on immigration while signing a trade deal with India, where he's given tax exemptions to Indian workers that are not available to their British counterparts. I think people will really begin to question the lunacy of closing down our steel factories, closing down our coal factories, importing coal from overseas at twice the price, smashing our already deindustrialized communities in the north. We're not there yet, but the bigger reform gets, the bigger that debate will become. The Labour government is about to bring in a new definition of Islamophobia in the UK, based on a definition that was developed in 2018. And John, that definition, in the report that was released that put forward this definition of Islamophobia, specifically mentioned discussing the grooming gangs, the rape gangs, as an example of Islamophobia.
Matt, thank you very much for joining us again.
Well, thank you for having me, John. It's a great time to have this discussion.
Well, we'll come in a moment to the way that you're entering into that discussion. But could you begin? You know, Australia and Britain are very close, and we're very interested in what's happening there in so many ways. Trends that emerge in Britain then appear here in ever reduced timeframes because of the impact of social media and the web and travel. Where's Britain today? It looks as though it's been fairly tumultuous in recent times.
Well, I think that's a good way of putting it, John. I think economically we are completely lost. We have almost no growth. We have masses of debt. We have declining productivity and living standards. Like other people, we're going through one of the worst cost of living crises since the Second World War. But culturally, we're very lost too. We are now beginning to grapple with the effects of a deliberate policy of mass uncontrolled immigration, which has been reshaping the country over the last quarter century, but is now reaching levels that really are quite staggering. And I'm sure we'll come on and talk about that during the discussion. And politically, we're seeing things that, to be frank, we've never really seen since the early years of the 20th century. Yes, we have a Labour government, a left-wing government with a big majority, but in the opinion polls, less than a year on from our last election, that Labour government is deeply unpopular. And we have an insurgent party led by Nigel Farage, the Reform Party, which is now, as we speak, in May 2025, is comfortably ahead of all of the main parties in the national polls. So we're seeing really for the first time since the emergence of the Labour Party in the early years of the 20th century, the reshaping, John, of the two-party system, which reflects this disillusionment, this distrust, this demoralization out there in the country. So it's a very interesting time to have this conversation.
A very big aspect, it seems to me, of the loss of vitality, I suppose you could say, almost the exhaustion in Western culture, has been the rise of mistrust, or the breaking down of trust, more simply. And that is tied in part, I think, to a loss of confidence in the media. The new media, you and I are both participants in the new media, is increasingly attracting people. They're increasingly relying on it for their information streams. You've been very active in that space and you've found a real appetite. Can you tell us, and we're going to provide the link, about your Substack and how it's going and what drives you? For example, our little motto is you can't get good public policy without a high quality debate. What's your theme and how's it going?
Well, I completely agree with everything that you've just said about the legacy media. I think for the first time, really in history, we have a new intellectual, cultural class that is fully independent and insulated from the legacy institutions. And I think partly things like YouTube and long form podcast have enabled that. But also from my perspective, Substack has been a real game changer because it's meant that I could leave essentially my full-time job as a university professor and join the public debate and have some real influence over that debate and policy by challenging the elite consensus, challenging the groupthink from the point of view of evidence. I don't think new media really should just be about, raging against the machine. I think we also have a responsibility to pursue truth, to take knowledge and evidence very seriously. And so I think our community, a bit like yours, John, has appealed to people who don't just want, hysteria and rage and polarization, but who take research and evidence seriously, who take ideas seriously, and who can sense that the legacy institutions are not being straight with them. And in my case, particularly with regards to Britain, a lot of people in our country are fed up of being lied to, are fed up of being misled and gaslit, particularly over issues like mass migration, border security, multiculturalism, being accused of suffering from misinformation, disinformation, while at the very same time, the political class and the state refuse to give them the information that they deserve to have as taxpayers to assess what is going on in their country. So one of the things we do is we make data and information available to people in an accessible way. And much of that does challenge the elite consensus in Westminster, Brussels, Washington and elsewhere. And I think that's one of the reasons we've been able to build a community.
You're achieving some pretty spectacular levels of penetration. What sort of numbers are following you on a regular basis?
Well, I mean, it's still early days, John. We're 2 years into this. In terms of combined numbers, I think we're hitting somewhere around 600,000 people every day, mainly in the UK. But obviously on social media, then, that's magnifying in terms of impressions and so on. And increasingly we're international. We've got readers in 181 countries. But I think for me, what's been most interesting about going down this new media route is when I started, people said, well, you're going into a cul-de-sac. You're not going to have influence if you leave the legacy institutions. I found completely the opposite. I'll just give you a couple of examples. We've advocated for policies that have been taken up by mainstream political parties, for example. I'll give you one. When the horrific grooming gang, rape gang scandal erupted in the UK, which Elon Musk helped to draw attention to at the beginning of 2025, and the world was rightly asking, how on earth did a civilized country like Britain allow hundreds of thousands of its own children to be trafficked, sexually assaulted and raped by Pakistani Muslim gangs? One of the things we did very early on is we campaigned for a policy change whereby anybody with dual nationality, who's both UK and, say, Pakistani, we said those people, if they're convicted of rape gang offences, should be deported out of the UK. They should be removed from the country, that if you rape our kids, you don't deserve to stay in our country. And that policy was later picked up by the Reform Party, which is now number one in the national polls. We've campaigned with many other people, I should add, for a national dedicated statutory inquiry into that scandal. It's absolutely outrageous that our political class has not committed to a dedicated inquiry into that issue. And we've also campaigned consistently for the state to release data and information on how mass migration is changing everything from welfare payments to the economy to criminality, and more. So, we've highlighted studies that have used things like freedom of information requests to force the state to tell us about arrest rates and conviction rates among different groups and by immigration status, because the state, John, wasn't releasing that information to people. It was saying, on the one hand, mass immigration is great for you, don't ask any questions, but then it wasn't releasing the data that it had. And actually, when you do look at that information, it confirms what many of us have suspected, which in the case of the UK, foreign nationals are more than twice as likely to be convicted of criminal offences, more than 3.5 times more likely than Brits to be convicted of sexual assault and rape. And some groups, such as Eritreans and people from Afghanistan, are 20 times more likely than British nationals to be arrested and convicted for those offences. These are just a couple of examples of things that we've identified. It is not about being irresponsible. It is not about being polarising. It is about telling people the truth. And if the BBC and other legacy institutions, were really interested in telling people the truth and really interested in fact checking and, doing all of this disinformation stuff, then they would be drawing attention to the things that we're drawing attention to. So I think that's one of the reasons we're cutting through.
The old left-right divide seems pretty useless. That's yesterday's definition, it seems to me. It's now all about those who are interested in pursuing facts, evidence, reasoned debate, finding reasonable conclusions versus those who want to run from the truth and just run on emotion and feelings all the time.
Yeah.
After all,
completely agree with you.
Well, in a practical sense, the current government you have in Great Britain replaced a so-called conservative one, but I don't think people were rejecting conservative. I don't think people were rejecting conservatism at all, were they, in Britain at that time?
No, essentially what's happened in the UK, this is where perhaps Australians, Canadians, Americans will be interested. We have 14 years of so-called conservative rule. But let's be clear, John, the Conservative Party, the Tories, under a succession of leaders, beginning with David Cameron, passing through Theresa May, Boris Johnson, briefly Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, what that era of conservative rule essentially did was mainstream social liberalism. That's essentially what it did. It mainstreamed mass migration, lost control of the borders, presiding over the small boat crisis that we have in the Channel. And this is not a small crisis, by the way. More than 160,000 illegal migrants, as you and I speak today, have crossed into the country illegally. The Conservatives also mainstreamed gender identity. They mainstreamed critical race theory in our schools. And they didn't promote and protect free speech, which is why today, 1 year on from our last national election, the Conservative Party is being replaced. We are witnessing the death of the Tories. The Conservative Party is being replaced by Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, which is campaigning on traditional, culturally conservative themes. Let's end all non-essential migration. Let's leave international courts and conventions that prevent us from controlling our own borders. Let's give people that national inquiry into the rape gangs, because that's about truth. That's about decency. Let's invest in areas outside of London. Let's have a tougher approach on the rule of law. Let's reduce taxation, particularly for small businesses in this country. John, we have the highest tax burden in the UK since 1948. It's absurd. Years after Brexit, our political class has essentially done the opposite of what they should have done by removing regulation, removing tax, making us more competitive. And instead, what they've done is increase tax, given us more regulation, increase net zero, raised energy prices to some of the highest levels in the world, while also flooding our economy with masses of low-wage, low-skill migration, which now even our Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, concedes is making us poorer, not richer. So I think the reassertion of conservative values, albeit through a new political party, is pretty much the only thing that is going to turn this Titanic around. And it needs to happen soon, John, because the pace of change and the scale of decline, there's so many of my friends from Australia and America who come to the UK and come to London. Yeah, they all say the same thing. I'm absolutely shocked by what has happened to Great Britain. And I'm with them. I've been in this country since 1981. I've never seen this scale of decline in my lifetime. And I think the reassertion of conservative values is probably the only thing that could actually turn it around.
It may amaze you to know that Australia actually has the fastest declining real disposable income levels in the OECD. We're not doing too badly in the race to the bottom either, and we've just had an election where, frankly, I think most Australians feel bitterly disappointed that neither side addressed the real issues. Neither side offered realistic solutions. Neither side spoke with any conviction. And I say that, I'm afraid, with sadly, in a way that has to reflect on the side of politics that I was involved with for so long. Can we just follow through? This is very interesting. I mean, you're the British Prime Minister, who for so long resisted the argument that immigration was out of control and deeply upsetting and concerning to the British people, has now issued a white paper, as I understand it, called Restoring Control Over the Immigration System. And he claims that he will fix the United Kingdom's broken borders. Isn't that a pretty major policy backflip? And what does it mean for reform, by the way? If they're driving this sort of reform, do they have to be in power, or are they actually able to influence events from outside?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What you're witnessing in the UK really is a big change in the immigration debate, but not necessarily immigration policy. So what's happened, just a 1 minute of context for viewers and listeners who may not be familiar. From 2004 until today, Britain has had an unprecedented experiment with mass immigration. It began with Tony Blair opening the doors to workers from within Europe. We saw net migration, the number of people coming in minus the number of people leaving, rocket from 50,000 at the end of the 1990s to about 350,000 by the time of the Brexit vote in 2016. And the Brexit vote, as all of the studies show, John, was primarily driven by concern over immigration and a desire to lower the overall numbers and control our borders. The Conservatives were the main beneficiary of that political realignment over migration. And when Boris Johnson really capitalized on that in 2019, winning an enormous majority, he promised the country lower overall numbers and a high-skill immigration policy. That was the Boris Johnson offer in 2019. What then happened in the years through the COVID pandemic is that Boris Johnson and the Tories, and I won't mince my words, they lied to the country, they betrayed Conservative voters, and they did the opposite of what they promised. Instead of a high-skill migration policy, we got a low-skill migration policy. Instead of lower numbers, we got record numbers that we've never seen before in British history. Net migration surged to basically 1 million people every year, meaning 1 million more people are coming into the country than leaving. And Boris Johnson also changed the origin of migration. So today, about 90% of all migration into Britain is coming from outside of Europe, from culturally different, if not incompatible nations, I would argue, such as Pakistan, parts of Africa, the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea. And so you've seen this explosion of legal migration, much of it low skill, much of it low wage. That, as now government reports are finally acknowledging, that is a net fiscal cost to the British taxpayer. It's not actually driving prosperity. It's not driving growth. And aligned to that, John, we've then lost control of the borders through illegal migration. From 2018 onwards, lots of illegal migrants began to arrive on small boats, with those numbers also surging. And so by the time of the election last year, the British people were understandably utterly frustrated, utterly fed up. And Keir Starmer and the Labour government really basically become the beneficiary of much of that. They're just the opposition. And they came in and said, well, let's take control of the borders and let's lower migration, or let's get our arms around it. The only problem with that, John, is basically what Keir Starmer and Labour did was the opposite of what you'd want to do to solve the immigration crisis. When it came to illegal migration, they removed the only deterrent that we had, which was the Conservative Party's Rwanda plan, which was to basically process illegal migrants offshore to send them to Rwanda. Labour got rid of that. They basically decriminalised illegal migration. They said, no, we're going to allow these people into Britain. We're going to put them up in hotels. We're going to put them up in private accommodation. We're going to be very generous in terms of welfare. And in terms of legal migration, as we're now seeing with Keir Starmer, they're basically tinkering around the edges, saying, well, we'll try and increase the skill level if we can. We're going to ask people to learn English. We think that's probably a good thing to do, given that that's our national language. And we're going to make some noises about multiculturalism not really working, but there's no legal cap on migration. Labour have not committed what number they want to preside over. Much of the economy is going to remain completely untouched by these measures. And Keir Starmer, bizarrely, is claiming to be tough on immigration while signing a trade deal with India, where he's given tax exemptions to Indian workers that are not available to their British counterparts. So he is incentivizing big business to basically hire workers from abroad who will be cheaper. There is no set number for what Keir Starmer would like to achieve in terms of migration levels. And as we know, left progressive parties basically are pretty instinctively comfortable with large amounts of migration. So nobody thinks this is going to work. Nobody really believes Keir Starmer when he says he's going to get tough on migration. And all of that is exactly why Nigel Farage is surging in the polls. Because if the top two reasons for voting reform in all of the surveys, in all of the polling, the top two reasons: stop the boats, stop the illegal migration, and lower the overall level of legal migration. Those are the top two reasons for voting reform. And as you and I talked, John, migration in May 2025 has just become the number one issue in British politics in the YouGov opinion polls. It's more important to people now than the economy. So this is a new realignment, basically. Brexit reshaped our politics in 2016 over our relationship with Europe, even if it was a proxy for migration. And now this new era of mass migration, this is my prediction, this is going to become the new fault line that is going to reshape British politics completely over the next 5-10 years, as millions of people outside of London, Oxford and Cambridge say, look, we do not recognize our country anymore. We do not want this pace of change. We do not want this scale of cultural transformation. We want to go back to something we recognize versus that elite minority in the Labour Party, the universities, the BBC, in the cities that is saying, well, actually, diversity is our strength and we're going to keep jamming this experiment down your throat. So that's basically where we are, John, in the migration debate.
It begs the question as to whether the Reform Party can put together, if you like, the right people, the right level of professionalism, the sort of people who are perhaps tough-minded in pursuit of their policies, but can be trusted. Break that spiral into the despair of feeling they never deliver. They're only interested in themselves. Can they break the political mold? Are they showing signs of that level of professionalism and commitment to rebuilding trust and goodwill and belief in Britain?
Well, the thing I would say about Reform is that they have everything going for them. They have ample public demand and there's enormous political space for a party that is tough on mass migration, that wants to reduce the cost of living by slashing net zero and by removing tax. If Nigel Farage remains focused on his core issues, there is unquestionably a big political market for him, bigger than anything he's had previously. That is why at the general election last year, he largely came from nowhere to win 5 seats, 4 million votes, not a large number of seats in the first past the post system, but a decent showing for a new party. Then at the local council elections in the spring of 2025, Reform became the first political party in contemporary history to finish ahead of both of the two big parties, Labour and the Tories. They won a national equivalent share of the vote of 30%. People said, they used to say Nigel Farage could not get above 15%. He got 30% of the equivalent share of the national vote at those elections. And all of the fundamental issues that are driving Reform, stagnant economy, migration that's out of control, broken borders, those things aren't going anywhere. They're going to stay with us. So the demand side is there, but you've hit the nail on the head, John, by pointing more to the supply side and saying, okay, does Reform have the organization? Does it have the team? Does it have the policies? Does it have the professionalism? And I think that's an open question. I think One of the Reform Party insiders described it to me as being like flying at 1,000 miles an hour in a plane while you're putting the plane together. That's essentially the inside view. They've had to build 500, 600 branches from scratch. They've had to put funding in place. They as yet don't really have a comprehensive policy offer. They've got sort of principles that they are putting forward, but there's no fully costed manifesto. And indeed, I suspect there won't be for a few years because, you also don't want to give your critics too much ammunition. But Nigel Farage essentially needs to do what Donald Trump did. He needs to put a team around him of people with government experience who are competent when it comes to policy and the implementation of policy. And he needs to have his plan for government basically finalized and in place before the next election. Because on current polling, John, he will be the next prime minister. Now, you could say that's midterm polling and things are going to change, and I would agree with you. But currently, in the national polls, Reform are heading for a parliamentary majority. So they need their Heritage Foundation. They need their America First Policy Institute. They need their first 100 days of government mapped out. They need their Great Repeal Bill, which will overturn Tony Blair's legislative legacy. They need their plan for exiting the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, which is stopping us from deporting foreign criminals and illegal migrants. They need their plan for revitalizing areas outside of London and taking down the net zero agenda. They need really the detail. And that's really where we are, because, when voters are looking at a protest party and outside a party and it's polling 15%, that's one thing. But when you're polling 30% in the national polls, voters will start to look at you as a potential party of government. And you need to then give those voters what they want to see: credibility, coherency, professionalism. And this is something that is Nigel Farage's, big priority. This is what he has to put together over the next 12 months to 18 months if he's going to have a chance at really pulling off something really, unprecedented in our country, John. He's already the only politician to win 2 nationwide elections with 2 different political parties. He won the 2014 European elections with UKIP, the UK Independence Party. He then won the 2019 European elections with the Brexit Party. He just won the local elections with the Reform Party. So there's no doubt that Farage can win national elections. But can he do what Trump didn't do in his first term and what Boris Johnson failed to do when he was given that 80-seat majority? Can Nigel Farage use electoral power to fundamentally transform the country? That is the question that everybody is now discussing.
One of the things that historians will note about Britain is that in many times down through the ages, Britain has slipped into a dangerous position. Any number of factors have contributed to that, but pull themselves back from the brink by what might be called their pluckiness and resolve when the going gets tough. Can a modern Britain that's so used to relying on government playing God, looking after their every need, responding to every clamour for more welfare, and now I would argue deeply fragmented and divided, not least of all because of the immigration policies themselves, bringing so many people who have no attachment to British culture?
Mm.
Are the British people up for the disciplines? Because they will be very real, needed to restore the economy and put the country on a better trajectory?
Well, there's an old saying, isn't there, that the Brits lose every battle except the last one. And I think I'm an optimist, John. I'm not a pessimist. I think it's very easy to look around and think, well, the state policy of multiculturalism is clearly failing. We have some pretty worrying surveys that suggest a significant share of Gen Z would not fight for the country and believe that Britain is a racist society. You've got a political leadership that's no longer really interested in the principle of national preference, in putting its own people first. They can't even be bothered to hold a national inquiry into the assault and rape of its own children. There are lots of reasons to be gloomy and pessimistic about Britain. But I'm a big believer in popular sovereignty. And I would just point to a couple of things that give me some quiet confidence. The first is Brexit. If you go back just a few years, it was the principle of popular sovereignty that got Brexit over the line when much of the elite class didn't want to do it. The moment that referendum was put onto the table, the people voted to push their country in a very different direction. And when over the next few years, the ruling class did everything they could to dilute it, stop it and soften it, the people said no, and they powered Boris Johnson into number 10. I have a firm, unwavering belief in the power and capacity of the English people and the British people to correct the system when the system is no longer working for them. I also think we can now see the beginnings of that change, not only in the rise of Reform and Nigel Farage, which is the most significant political insurgency, as I say, since the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century. Politics is being transformed by the people who are pushing that party forward. But you can also see it reflected in the changing positions of the mainstream parties, who have now realized that they have moved so far to the cultural left, especially on issues like migration and borders, that they are simply no longer in touch with the average voter. And as a consequence, they may not survive as viable political organizations. We are witnessing the death of the Tory party, one of the oldest, most successful political parties in the history of democracy. As you and I speak today, is polling 17% in the national polls, 17. The pollsters would never, ever have believed that the Conservative Party could plummet to those lows. And I don't think that's the flaw, by the way. I think they will continue to decline. So we are seeing the system beginning to correct itself. And even if I don't believe Keir Starmer and the Labour Party for a second when it comes to the issues of migration, they are already using the language, the discourse, the vibes that conservatives and conservative-minded people have been pushing through. And if you believe that idea that politics now is more about the vibes than necessarily the sort of, the old left-right debate, then, I would say we're winning. People like me, people who care about, reasserting our national values, pushing back against this elite experiment, we're winning the argument. Globally, I would also say, I think there are lots of signs that we're winning. Look at what's happening in Germany. Look at what's happening in Sweden. Look at what's happening in Italy. Look at what's happening in America. I think we are actually beginning to see quite a sustained pushback against the liberal excesses of the 1990s, 2000s and 2010s. And I think, there are obviously always exceptions. The election results in some countries don't always reinforce that. But I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic about the direction of travel.
Can I ask you, you mentioned that the polling is now showing that number one concerns immigration and then illegal immigration and then the economy. I notice you didn't mention the environment and net zero. Britain's allowed to ask the question again now, is net zero 2050 feasible and can you do it without smashing the economy? Are you allowed to ask that question yet in Britain?
I think we are certainly allowed to ask it. And I think the net zero consensus is starting to break down. We have two, big parties on the right, the Reform Party and then, the Conservatives, who are both net zero skeptics now, are basically questioning everything to do with net zero and the targets. And I think voters are catching up. The old saying was that you couldn't really contest net zero because it was a valence issue, meaning that 70-80% of people, even if they didn't quite understand what net zero was all about, they just thought, oh, this is good for the environment, I'll go along with it. I don't think that is really true anymore. People are very anxious about their energy bills, some of the highest energy bills in the world here in the UK. People are very, I think, skeptical about some of the energy projects that are happening around them. People are very concerned about the influence of China in our energy markets. And I think they're beginning to revisit net zero and think, well, actually, this isn't everything that I thought it was about. So I think increasingly net zero is going to be pulled into mainstream politics as a point of debate. It isn't there yet. As I say, the dominant issues here remain migration and the cost of living crisis. But if to go back to Nigel Farage, if reform can link the cost of living crisis, not just with taxation, not just with a broken model of mass migration, and not just with regulation, if they can link the cost of living crisis with net zero, if they can open that up, then I think that issue will become enormous, potentially as big as Brexit in the years ahead. I think people will really begin to question, the lunacy of closing down our steel factories, closing down our coal factories, importing coal from overseas at twice the price, smashing our already deindustrialized communities in the north even more by this insane net zero obsession. And I think people will start to question it, but it will take time. And we're not there yet. But the bigger reform gets, the bigger that debate will become.
I think one of the things that is contributing to the breakdown in trust, and will do so more if people don't come clean, is that the left refuses to be honest when it says we must, for environmental reasons, move to net zero. We must turn our energy systems upside down, but no, it won't cost you. That is a monstrous distortion of reality. And the evidence is now quite clear. The higher the penetration of renewables, wherever you go, the higher electricity prices are. It's been quite dramatic in Australia. The surge in electricity prices has accelerated as there's been more renewables introduced into the system, and it's very marked, and it is a massive contributor to the decline in living standards, a so-called cost of living crisis in Australia. And my charge is a very simple one. If you believe that this is so important that we need to impoverish ourselves, then argue the case. It's a free country. Restore trust. So I believe, as a legislator, that we have to reduce our emissions and we have to wear the lower living standards that will go with it. It's simply not sustainable anymore to argue that you can have both. You can't do it.
Well, I completely agree with you. I think the same applies not just to net zero, but to a cluster of issues that have become something of a new religion for the elite class. And I think here in Britain, we've seen the Labour Party become very utopian in how it views net zero, in how it views migration, in how it views diversity. It tells people constantly that these things will bring benefits, will bring advantages, will, grow the economy, when in reality, these things are doing the very opposite. I mean, it is bizarre that if you think about the expert class, one of the things that I've struggled with increasingly, I was in the universities for 20 years. I've been in the rooms with politicians, with professors from Harvard and Oxbridge, and I've been at the workshops, and I've seen this thing from the inside out. And the thing that I've always been struck by is the extent to which the expert class will pretty much bend every study or piece of research to reinforce their ideological priors. Motivated reasoning is rife on university campus and in places like Westminster. And these are also the people, as we know, that are not paying the costs of these policies. So it's very easy for the expert class to sit and say, well, mass immigration is going to drive the economy. They're not the ones that are going to really be dealing with the downside. As Rob Henderson, I think on your podcast has said previously, they are the luxury belief class. And this is why people are so distrustful of that expert class, because they can now sense that they're not actually really interested in evidence at all. We've had another example in the UK. We had the Supreme Court judgment recently, which confirmed what many of us have argued for many years, which is that the definition of a woman is biological and is based on biological sex. And the immediate reaction to that from the British Medical Association, the BMA, a kind of collection of junior doctors and medical professionals, was to basically protest the judgment by the UK Supreme Court, saying it basically didn't believe it. And that I was trying to argue that we should maintain a policy of gender self-identification. These are supposed to be the experts, John. These are supposed to be the people who are working from the point of view of science, who are working from the point of view of knowledge. I look at Home Office ministers, interior security ministers here in Britain, lying to people on TV, saying, well, actually, our policy when it comes to the borders, we're lowering the number of illegal migrants, our plan is working. When, as you and I talk now in 2025, the number of small boats crossing into the UK is up 40% on the same time last year in 2024. It's up 80% on the same time in 2023. But the expert class are out there saying, well, our plan is working. We're improving things. And there's just an enormous amount of gaslighting, and misleading information going on from the very people who are telling us to trust the experts, and support the ruling class. I'll just give you one last example because this really will shock people outside of the UK. You know, we had the Southport atrocities here in the country, where 3 little girls at a Taylor Swift, a dance class, were tragically murdered by the son of Rwandan migrants, Axel Rudakabana. And in the aftermath of that atrocity, many people in England took to the streets to protest the policies of mass migration, broken borders, and their belief that the state was not being truthful to them, was not telling them what was really going on. Now, at the time, the Labour government, Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, said, this is the far right. This is an organised far right movement that is campaigning to mislead the public. We've just had, in early 2025, a report from the police, an investigation into those disturbances, which has concluded there was no far-right movement, network, or organisation active in the aftermath of the Southport protests. And these were protests, remember, where ordinary people were thrown into jail because of what they were saying on social media, which happened to violate these Orwellian hate laws. When people see this playing out, this level of dishonesty, level of gaslighting, that is why trust in the system is collapsing, because they can see there is this officially approved narrative which tries to stigmatize and shut down alternative viewpoints, which tries to expand concepts like far right, which tries to expand terms like hate to shut down criticism. The Labour government is about to bring in a new definition of Islamophobia in the UK, based on a definition that was developed in 2018. And John, that definition, in the report that was released that put forward this definition of Islamophobia, specifically mentioned discussing the grooming gangs, the rape gangs, as an example of Islamophobia. So if you and I were having this podcast, let's say a year from now, when this new definition is in play, and I'm sat here saying to you, well, John, let me tell you about the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs. In theory, under this definition, somebody could say, well, Matt Goodwin's being Islamophobic. We're going to lodge a hate crime against him for saying that. This is the level that we are now at in the UK, and it is deeply chilling. And it's fueling this distrust, this kind of complete collapse of faith that the system is interested in evidence, interested in knowledge, has people's best interests at heart, and is actually upholding the traditions of individual liberty and free speech that have long defined these islands.
I gather it can be described, is often now described as far right, to express concern about the grooming gangs themselves. How on earth did England get to the point where expressing deep concern about the plight of really large numbers of relatively poor, I suppose you'd say, girls were so badly harmed, so badly abused? You ask questions about it and eyebrows are raised because you sound right-wing and Islamophobic.
Well, I mean,
How did Britain get to that point?
Well,
Is this part of the progressive mantra that all cultures are equal?
It's definitely, at its root, it is about radical progressivism. It is about the obsession of the elite class with protecting the emotional safety of minorities, which basically defines progressivism in my mind. They are so obsessed with protecting and promoting racial, sexual, and gender minorities, protecting their perceived emotional safety, that they will ignore, play down, and attack anything that violates that view that minorities are virtuous and the majority is to be treated with suspicion and contempt. It is really touching on that notion of sort of hyper empathy. And the problem is...
But what about hyper empathy for the girls, many of whose lives have been, I would imagine, irreversibly damaged by what they experienced?
John, it's absolutely...
And you're not talking about just a few hundred. You're talking about how many? Tens of thousands?
I know, hundreds of thousands, John, hundreds of thousands. We have one MP who estimates since the 1980s, you could be talking about 1 million children being assaulted and raped. So, well, the answer is it violates the left progressive worldview because these white working class girls are belonging to the majority group and they are not considered to be as virtuous, as morally righteous as minorities. That's the reality. And it's compounded by the fact that the Labour Party draws most of its votes, the vast majority of British Muslims are voting for the Labour Party, a party that is now losing a lot of seats to disgruntled Muslim voters over what is happening in the Middle East. And, you know, when this scandal was blown open again by Elon Musk, because it first really erupted in 2011 when a couple of journalists began to talk about it, even though there were people before that, Tommy Robinson, among others, who had been talking about it, and they were swiftly shut down by the establishment. When journalists first started talking about it in 2011 and the scale of it became apparent, people started to have a look. But just to give you an idea, even after the Elon Musk intervention in early 2025, when the world became interested in this scandal, only a couple of weeks ago, as you and I are talking now in May 2025, a Labour minister went on a very popular radio show, a BBC radio show. Somebody raised the issue of the rape gangs, and her response, Lucy Powell, a Labour minister, you can find it online, her response was, "Oh, here we go. It's the dog whistle. This is a dog whistle talking about it, as in you're racist if you talk about the grooming gangs." And this is after everything has come out. This is after all of the evidence and the testimony, the court cases, local inquiries. And what's most outrageous for me is even today in 2025, the Labour government, despite knowing what has happened, despite knowing police officers have been involved, despite knowing social workers have been involved, despite knowing we found rape gangs in upwards of 50 towns and cities in the UK, despite knowing all of that, despite victims coming forward, telling us what has happened, how they were passed around from one town to another from the age of 11, were put on heroin and cocaine. Despite knowing that, the Labour government still refuses to hold a national dedicated inquiry. What it's doing instead is it's holding 4 or 5 local inquiries where local councils are basically asked to mark their own homework, and the councils that are most likely to have basically presided over some of the most horrific atrocities, areas like Bradford, for example, well, they've announced they're not going to do a local inquiry. Shock horror, because if they did, you know, it would look bigger than any of the other revelations that we've had until now. They've allocated £5 million, John, to look at the rape gangs again. 5 million. The British establishment just gave £117 million to protect mosques and British Muslim communities from hate. Okay, so these numbers reflect the priority list of the ruling class, and this issue is not going to go away. You know, we've had reliable polling on it from people like YouGov. 75% of Brits say, "I want a national inquiry." 77% of Brits say we should deport dual nationals who were implicated in this scandal. And if it's not systemic, when police officers are involved and social workers are involved, and it's taking place in 50 towns, you know, what is it? It's obviously a systemic national scandal. So let's get that inquiry. Let's give it proper funding. Let's give it proper legal power so we can compel witnesses, false witnesses to give evidence, and we can punish people in public positions who were implicated in the scandal and who looked past the scandal. And let's make sure it never happens again. This, to me, should be a no-brainer for the ruling class. But they are just continuously kicking it into the long grass.
It should surely also kill off the notion that all cultures are the same. I know that's a blunt thing to say, but it isn't true. And we diminish ourselves when we won't stand by our own culture. So in your country, well, as you've said it, hundreds of thousands of native-born British girls are subject to degradations that normally would have a Me Too type movement of some sort, or a BLM out on the streets. Somehow that's swept under the carpet because you can't criticize another culture. You can't defend your own, and you can't criticize another culture. How does that work?
Middle class liberal feminists said nothing about the rape gang scandal during the Me Too era, and they knew it was happening. They said nothing about it at all. The underlying problem here, just aside from the issue itself, we need to be clear about what the problem is. The underlying problem is the state policy of multiculturalism, which has prioritized group difference over integration and commonality. So for decades, the state has actively encouraged minority communities like Pakistani Muslim communities by enabling things like cousin marriage, Sharia courts, funding for identity celebrations that are not made available to the British people. The British state has actively encouraged the isolation and segregation and practices that led to the rape gang scandal. So the answer is not just to do the inquiry and to do all of that. The answer is to go back to what David Cameron and Angela Merkel said in 2010. Multiculturalism has failed. They said that 15 years ago. Okay, but yet we've not moved on to identify what the successor policy to multiculturalism should be. Now, I would argue you need to do two things in not just Britain, but the West. You need to you need to do three things. You need to dramatically reduce migration, reshape existing migration policy around nations that are culturally similar and compatible, including much stronger border security, which requires revisiting the post-1945 refugee legislative architecture. You need to go all the way back to basics and redo the laws that govern refugee and asylum in Western states and make it much harder for people to relocate into Western states. You secondly need a series of policies, a little bit like Denmark and to some extent Sweden are doing, which is not just a nod at integration by saying everybody should speak, the national language, but is essentially forced integration. We're not going to have segregated schooling. We're not going to have segregated housing developments. You are going to have obligations. You're not just going to have endless rights. You are going to have to be an active citizen. Yes, you're going to have to sign up to shared values. And yes, if you break our laws, there are going to be much more severe consequences than there are currently. You need to do that as well, because I don't think anybody in Britain anymore talks about integration. Keir Starmer in May 2025 said, we are at risk of becoming an island of strangers. And of course, everybody in the BBC, London liberal class, had a meltdown at the fact that the Prime Minister was suggesting nobody really knows anybody anymore. Well, to everybody who lives outside of the M25, the roundabout that surrounds London, that has been evident for the last 20 to 30 years. We have highly segregated communities, and we now actually have communalism within those communities where you have, for example, Hindus and Sikhs fighting with Muslims, and the British, the white British majority isn't even involved in some of those conflicts now. So you've got this kind of gradual descent into sectarianism, segregation, that the British establishment is sort of not even talking about and not even acknowledging. So we need to have a complete gear shift in dramatically lowering migration, investing in assimilation, and then starting to talk about how we are going to encourage people to have more children and support families. Now, that's the third part of that, because we're going to have to also tackle the demographic crisis that's bearing down on Western nations and start doing things like what Hungary and Poland are doing, even though so far the evidence of that is a bit mixed. But we need to be much more ambitious in how we're supporting Western families and encouraging people to have more children. Because if we don't do that, that's a longer term problem that is going to be used by the state to justify the continuation of the status quo.
It's certainly the case that the question of aren't there too many of us is very much yesterday's question for most countries in the world today. The reality is that we're facing a depopulation bomb. And the numbers in Britain, as I understand it, are quite extraordinary. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Muslim population of Britain now is around 7 or 8%. And you could argue that they now control a significant number of seats in the parliament. And with the likely doubling of their numbers over the next decade, they will control, presumably, even more seats. Now, so a democracy advocate might say that's a good thing, but the problem is if there's no shared heritage, if you're just a nation of tribes, if you don't have any commitment to the institutions of freedom, including democracy and the parliaments, how does that play out? Does it open the way for a really quite radical and permanent overturning of British society?
Well, if you look at the forecasts by reliable research centres like Pew, the Pew Research Centre, they forecast that Britain will be somewhere between 18 and 20% Muslim by the year 2050. So 1 in 5 people in the population will be Muslim by 2050, which really isn't that long away, not long at all. Obviously, in other countries, Sweden, it's much more dramatic. It's 31, 32%. I think France and Belgium are also a little bit higher than the UK. So the debates that we are starting to have now, 5 politicians being elected at the national general election last year, specifically on pro-Gaza, anti-Israel platforms, not even talking about domestic issues in Britain, just talking about the Middle East issue. The debates that we're having about the compatibility of Islam with free speech and free expression. We still have a secondary school teacher in this country in hiding because he showed an image in a class that was considered to be insulting to Muslims. That kind of gradual bearing down on individual rights, women's rights, our common law tradition through Sharia courts, I think that pressure will inevitably increase as these demographic trends play out. But what worries me more than that is the complete refusal and inability of anybody in Westminster to even have an open and frank discussion about what you could do to stop some of that from happening or try and get ahead of it. Even by us having this conversation, inevitably somebody will say, well, Matt is engaging in sensational, inflammatory discussion that is Islamophobic. That is the level of debate that we have in this country. You can't even come forward and say, okay, why don't we have a much more ambitious strategy for ensuring integration within these communities? I mean, if you read, for example, if there's one book I could recommend, which really made an impression on me, it was Ed Hussein's book, Among the Mosques, where he turned up at random to, I think, a few dozen mosques in the UK. He didn't tell people he was coming. And he finds very clear evidence of extremist ideology, pretty visible. He makes the point that if you're a young British Muslim, you can spend your entire day in many areas of the country, from waking up to going to school, to going to mosque, to hanging out in your neighborhood, never interacting at all with the non-Muslim British majority. And there are lots of neighborhoods like that in Birmingham, in Oldham, in northwest England, parts of London. And I still don't think we've even come close to reckoning with the collapse of civic integration in our country. It's been 24 years since we had riots across northern England. And Tony Blair's government said, okay, we've got to do something about the fact that people are living parallel lives. That was the phrase. People were living parallel lives. And as I look around today in the political and public debate, in some respects, we've gone backwards. We've not even moved forwards in terms of coming up with a serious response to what we're seeing. And you're right, John, to point to the trends. I mean, I've done surveys myself. About 40% of British Muslims say they would like a Muslim-only political party in British politics. And we have actually an organization called Muslim Votes, which tries to organize 4 million votes at UK elections, specifically along religious lines. We have slates of candidates in cities in Birmingham, for example, so-called independent candidates, but they are organized increasingly along Muslim lines. And very few people are willing to talk about it. And very few people are willing to say, well, this is sectarianism, like what we had in Northern Ireland. But it's now rearing its head in mainstream British politics and is now represented in the House of Commons. But nobody's talking about it.
I was in England, in London, in February of this year, not so very long ago. And a very nice man, a Pakistani, was driving me around in an Uber. And we went past a big bus shelter with a massive sign on it, praise Allah, and pay your, I can't remember the term, but the taxes that they levy on themselves. I asked him about those. He explained what they were. I said, you're a Muslim? He said, yes, I'm a Muslim. I said, do you take it seriously? He said, no, I don't go to prayers. He said, I don't take it seriously. He said, but I have 4 children and they go to school and they come back and they absolutely know what is right and what is wrong. I thought that was a very interesting insight. He is not particularly engaged as a Muslim, but he was making it very plain that his 4 children are.
And the evidence backs that up. The second, third generation, fourth generation are more religious usually than their fathers and grandparents. There is something going on among young Muslims, not just in Britain but across the West, who appear to be more radical than their older relatives. And obviously that should be concerning. I mean, in Britain, there is this pretty significant fact that more British Muslims left our country to fight for Islamists in Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq than are currently serving in the British Army. I mean, that should be a wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people. Again, you're not really supposed to talk about that. You're not really supposed to discuss that because multiculturalism is working and everything is fine. So we enter the parallel reality here. We have to get politics and the public debate to this point where we recognize the failures and we can start to try and put together a policy mix that will actually do something about this. I think that's it's the point I keep coming back to because it's very easy to throw your hands in the air and say, well, you can't change things. But I think, again, to go back to that point about reform in the next election, there's going to have to be a comprehensive policy for slashing migration, net migration back to below 100,000, reshaping it around high-skill migration from culturally compatible nations, and alongside that, having a new, robust framework for integration that really does push the taboos out of the way. We could end cousin marriage tomorrow if we wanted to. That would be useful. We could shut down the 85 Sharia courts that we have in this country. That would be useful. We could ensure there is no blasphemy law through the back door, no definitions of Islamophobia. We could start mixing schools much more than we currently do. We could clamp down on Muslim organizations that have links to Islamists and are still being tolerated by the British state. There's lots of things we could do if we had the leadership to do them, John. And I hope we get that leadership sooner rather than later.
The left has become, it seemed, rather enamored with critical theory. I say it seems because I find it incredible that something as obviously silly as critical theory could gain academic respectability and flow out of our universities into the streets and into mainstream society. But it, of course, essentially holds that the world's evils result from white racism. The problem of the world is white racism. No one denies that white racism exists, but to say that it is the source of all evil, that, if you like, white men in particular are to blame for everything that's gone wrong, rather strikes me as immature in the face of what we're now looking at. You yourself have made the comment, I found this very interesting, racism by non-whites against whites not only exists in Britain, but might be even worse than the reverse. That would turn critical theory on its head if there were any evidence for it, Matt.
Well, I think that's true, actually. I mean, if you look at the survey evidence of, hostility, opposition to intergroup marriage, for example, it's often much higher among minority groups than it is among the white British majority. That's pretty clear. I think, as I say, we've got more evidence of intergroup tension and violence, minority on minority prejudice and violence in areas like Leicester, Birmingham, than we have evidence of white on minority violence. So, I mean, I think definitely, the evidence is there. I think the grooming gang the grooming gang scandal is another example of that. But look, I've been in the universities for 20 years, John, so it doesn't surprise me at all that these ideas became mainstream, because the university system itself is completely corrupt and has been hijacked by these ideologies. And to be honest with you, has been hijacked by mediocrity, is my view. I mean, I think we're drawing up a long shopping list of things that we need to do in terms of saving Britain and saving Western nations, but one of them would also be dramatically reforming the higher education sector, which has mainstreamed these ideas, allowed academic committees and departments to be basically hijacked, and also surrounded them with an enormous bureaucracy that was then incentivized to further spread these ideas, because the bureaucracy depended upon diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to justify its own existence. So, we need to take a hammer to that system, much like Donald Trump is doing in the US. We need to completely root that out. So it doesn't surprise me that these ideas became mainstream. But even if you point out the counterfactuals to the elite class, as I do regularly, they will still, at the end of the day, just ignore you. There is still a refusal to engage with empirical research and evidence which challenges the progressive worldview. For example, white working class boys are the worst performers at every level of the education system. Primary school, secondary school, undergraduate, MA, PhD, that is the group that is most visibly being left behind. White working class boys on pretty much every measure. Yet the elite conversation would have you believe, through Netflix dramas like Adolescence, that white working class boys are inherently problematic. They are evil. They are toxic. They are being pushed around by Andrew Tate and others, and they are reframed in the national conversation as being a problem. Whereas, in fact, if you look, for example, at knife crime in the UK, if Adolescence had been an empirically accurate drama, it wouldn't have been a white working class boy murdering a white girl in the school ground. These are narratives that I think make the elite class feel better about themselves. Like the only major BBC documentary we had on the rape gang scandal until recently was about a white girl who lied about being trafficked and assaulted by an Asian gang. That was an actual BBC documentary about the rape gangs. It was an inversion of the reality that here was a white girl lying about being groomed. So the media class, the creative class, I think also has a lot of responsibility and a lot of questions to answer, to be honest, in how it portrays and represents what is actually unfolding in our society.
One final thing that I'd be interested in your views on is this. What surprises me about the modern left, well, many things surprise me. One is their desertion of the family. If there's one thing the Labor Party and the left used to be good at, it was defending the family. They never talk about family now. But another thing that surprises me is that for all of the talk about personal freedom and personal autonomy, allowing people, complete control over their lives, there seems to be, and I think you've touched on this, a deep authoritarianism in much of the modern Labor left, and in particular in the government you have in Britain today. Apart from their restrictions on free speech and the contortions they go to trying to manipulate the narrative around grooming gangs and other events like that, what do you see as the evidence that they're deeply authoritarian?
Well, to go back just briefly to the point about family, I think it was Christopher Lasch who pointed out in one of his books from a disillusioned leftist perspective that, the attack on the family was often led by so-called progressives who viewed the family as being, essentially a block on their view of individual liberation, that what the progressive left wants to do is remove all guardrails, nation, family, community, in the quest for their definition of freedom. And of course, that just leaves us with no meaning, purpose, or sense of belonging whatsoever. And I do think that's partly what's playing out in part of the West today. The Labour government in Britain is, I think, probably one of the most authoritarian governments I've seen in my lifetime. I mean, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, their Labour governments also were notorious for having an authoritarian streak. But Keir Starmer brings a sort of a legal, bureaucratic, managerial aspect to it, whereby this government has, presided over a pretty visible erosion of free speech and free expression. It's expanded these things that we have called non-crime hate incidents, which is if somebody perceives you to have said something hateful or hurtful to your protected characteristics, say your sex or your gender or your race, one of these non-crime hate incidents can be filed against you and made available to your employer should you go for a job in the future. And about 250,000 people have had one of these logged against them in recent years. We've had people like Lucy Connolly, a young mother and wife of her husband who's very unwell. She was thrown into prison for nearly 3 years under this Labour government for what she put on Twitter in the aftermath of Southport. She wrote something that was, very spicy. Immigration isn't working. If that makes me a racist, makes me a racist. 4 hours later, she deleted it, thought better of the tweet, and she was put in prison for nearly 3 years, and she was denied access to see her family. Whereas we've had Labour politicians who have physically assaulted their own constituents. We've had one Labour MP who was suspended from Parliament because he was filmed beating up one of his constituents at 2:00 in the morning, and he didn't go to prison. So there's been this perception of a two-tier society whereby if you are challenging the left's sacred values, you're much more likely to be dealt with this authoritarian response than if you're, say, a member of a minority group or member of the Labour Party. We've also, John, just lastly, we've seen the introduction of this new definition of Islamophobia, which will inevitably be used to try and control public debate over Islam and associated issues. And we've seen a very robust and quite chilling response to things like the Southport atrocities, where Keir Starmer has basically said, if you question migration and borders, you are far right, you are essentially beyond the pale. So that the language of this government is very Orwellian. And I think that it's another indication of where Britain is moving away from the things that used to be really the foundations of our society. I was always very influenced by Roger Scruton and the way that he talked about our common law tradition, our long tradition of individual liberty, of political continuity, of freedom in all of its forms. And yet today, many people outside of the UK looking in cannot make sense as to why people are being put in prison for something they've written on social media in their own home, why the state is overreaching to such a degree, and why politicians are trying so visibly, so hard to control what can be said and what cannot be said, in the home of, Magna Carta and free speech. And this is not me embellishing. These things are all happening. And again, this is up to this insurgent party, Reform, and Nigel Farage to try and correct the balance. And that means we will abolish all non-crime hate incidents in that legislation. We will abolish hate law, the hate law industrial complex. We don't need it. We've got laws from the 1980s that make it clear if you are racist, if you are discriminatory. We have laws that can deal with that. We do not need this Orwellian layer on top, which has sort of mainstreamed this notion of hate. And we should be protecting and promoting free speech within the institutions, particularly universities and schools, and teaching children about the importance of free speech. And if we can get back to those things, the common law tradition, free speech, free expression, I think we'll be in a much better place as a society.
Well, to sign off, can I ask you a question? You must have a lot of feedback from your Substack and your interactions with the community by means various. Are you encouraged by the emergence of a new thoughtfulness and a new determination amongst the best of our young people? Well, in Australia, I'm finding that. Are you seeing that in England?
I am, yeah. No, I am very, very optimistic about the ecosystem that is emerging. If you can go back to 2015, go back 10 years ago, and you look at the landscape, it was nowhere near as dynamic and varied and diverse in an intellectual sense as it is now. I mean, if you look at the kinds of shows and podcasts, new universities, new institutions that have gone, that have really emerged and have given people a home, somewhere to join, somewhere to explore, somewhere to critique, somewhere to discuss, to have good faith debate. I'm very optimistic about all of those things. New universities in Austin, Buckingham, Ralston College, Peterson Academy, important YouTube shows, podcasts like your own, big shows, Trigonometry and others. I think this climate in which, we've collectively decided to let 1,000 flowers bloom, I think has been one of the positive things in the last decade. We do need to be careful with it. I think the debate between Douglas Murray and Joe Rogan recently was very interesting in pointing to the responsibility the new media ecosystem has to maintain a commitment to truth, evidence, historical accuracy, and to some extent expertise, expertise in the true meaning of the word, not the kind of ideology-led expert class that we have today. And I think if we can maintain that commitment to evidence and truth rather than just, building rage machines, I think that will be really, really important. And it is playing a really important role in this wider pushback, because you have to change the culture. You've got to change the water in which the fish swim. And I think all of this is part of that. It is about setting a stage for, politics lying downstream of culture change. I think that's really important.
Matt, you've been terrific. Thank you very much, and I hope many people find this an interesting conversation.
Well, thank you, John, for having me, and thank you also for leading so many of these conversations. I'm an avid listener and viewer of your show, and again, I think it's a crucial part of this wider pushback. So thank you for all of the work you're doing as well.
Thanks, Matt. Great to talk to you.